Are you looking to get ahead in FPL with some crafty differentials? Well, this video is for you. Now, the first player I'm going to talk about, and to be honest, he's already caught a few eyes having taken the last penalty for Chelsea. That's Cole Palmer. 4.9 million. Seems to be nailed in the Chelsea starting 11. And I'd also suggest he's kind of playing with a bit of a chip on his shoulder to prove that he deserves to start for a top Premier League team. He's got some tough fixtures coming up, don't get me wrong, but 4.9 million, maybe if you're wildcarding in Game Week 9, or if you're just looking for a decent bench option in your midfield for the next few game weeks, I think he's fantastic. 4.9 million, as I said, is really good value for someone that's regularly starting for Chelsea, looks to be taking their penalties, and I just think he's going to undoubtedly rise up in price. In comparing the number of starts he's had to the number of attacking returns that he's had, 0.71 expected returns per 90, he's one of the top players in the Premier League for those stats, so he really does look a good option at 4.9 million. Overall, his ownership is less than 1%, and it's basically 0.5% in the top 10k. So there isn't a bigger differential, in my opinion, at the moment than Cole Palmer. The next player I wanted to talk about is Gabriel. Now, start of the season, a few players would have had him and got absolutely punished by Arteta using his new sort of shape defence against the low block teams, and he didn't play. He's gone down now to 4.7 million, obviously started the season off at 5, and he's starting regularly for Arsenal again, and Arsenal are looking just as good defensively as they were last season, and I think, in my opinion, Arteta needs to keep playing Gabriel because he's clearly part of that back four that's just the strongest for Arsenal. Overall, he's owned by 12.5% of players. Now, I think some of those are going to be inactive teams from the start because, quite simply, he wasn't playing for a good period of time, and it was a sensible decision to sell him if you did start the season with him, and that's shown in the top 10k. Only 3% of managers currently have him. Last season, he had the highest expected goals amongst all defenders in the Premier League. That's not come to fruition yet. I feel like with Sheffield United and Burnley, two teams that are pretty terrible at defending set pieces, where obviously Gabriel is dangerous from, I feel like there could be some goal threat in those games. And yeah, my general point, Arsenal are now emerging, in my opinion, as one of the strongest defences in the league. With Raya in goal and his ability on the ball, I think it means Arsenal are going to keep even more possession than they did previously. And I think that's only going to strengthen their chances of keeping clean sheets. And Gabriel looks to be nailed in that Arsenal team, particularly with Timber still being injured. So I think he's a great differential at that ownership. Pedro Neto looks a fantastic option alongside Cole Palmer. That sort of under 6 million price tag for a midfielder at the moment is kind of a spot I think is almost needed in quite a lot of FPL teams at the moment. It's a nice spot where there are multiple options at that price point. I've got another player to talk about that's under 6 million after this as well, but Neto is ticking along really nicely. He's the top midfielder in FPL for assists this season. I think Wolves have got reasonable fixtures coming up as well. They look to be a really decent team under Gary O'Neill, and they have already upset Man City, so who's to say they can't score against Newcastle and Spurs, particularly at home. As I was saying, I think he's good for, you know, team structure overall, that sort of sub 6 million price tag. A few players at that price tag you could go for as well, particularly, you know, if he doesn't perform, gets injured or whatever. It's not just you're stuck with him, you can go to other players at that price tag. And genuinely, 4 expected assists this season is one of the top players in the Premier League for that stats. And that suggests to me that he's one of the most creative players in the league. Overall, his ownership is 8.8%. In the top 10k, it's 8%. A little bit higher owned than the previous two players we've spoken about, but I still think under 10%. Definitely a differential. I do expect his price to rise across the season with how consistent he's been with returns so far. I can only see that continuing. Pedro Neto is a really nice differential. The thumbnail star of the video up next, and in my opinion, coming back from injury, Martinelli is probably the best differential in FPL at the moment. My general point is we all know how good he is, right? He's absolutely rapid and he can score a goal against any opposition, of course, as we saw against Man City. Yeah, I think he's the first choice left winger in that Arsenal team. He proved that last season when Trossard was waiting in the wings. Even when Trossard started above Martinelli, Martinelli came on and scored when he came off the bench. 7.7 million now for him. Obviously, it was 6.5 at the start of last season, so you can't say he's super duper cheap, but I think it's great value for the potential that he has. He hasn't gotten off, I'll admit, to the strongest start yet this season, but I think fixtures coming up look all right. I feel like he can only kick on. And as I was saying, you know, he seems to be Arteta's first choice left winger, and we all know how dangerous he is, right? I think that price is only going to rise. He's going to become more and more popular. 4.2% ownership overall. And in the top 10k, basically 0 managers have him. I think 0.2%, what's that? Is that 200 managers or maybe less? Anyway, someone can tell me in the comments. I'm pretty sure that's 200 managers in the top 10k that currently have Martinelli. So a fantastic differential option if you're looking to get ahead. Finally then is another midfielder in this sort of sub 6 million price category. We saw when we looked at Pedro Neto. If you read the words on the slides, you'd have seen Gordon's name pop up. Ownership overall, 5.5%, less than 1% owned in the top 10k. He's got a return every start, well, for every start that he's had in the Premier League. In my opinion, he looks to be the first choice left winger for Newcastle. The fact he works really hard defensively and the fact that Harvey Barnes is injured makes me think he's got that spot nailed. And he's putting up some really strong numbers. As I was saying, he's got an attacking return for every start he's had. Decent fixtures coming up. You've got Pedro Neto, Cole Palmer, Anthony Gordon, all differentials at a similar price tag. Take your pick, really. And that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Usually I don't like making videos about differentials because I don't like taking massive punts in FPL, but I don't think any of the players that I've spoken about are really big punts. They're either super cheap that doesn't really matter if they don't perform, you can just bench them, or they've got a history of strong returns in previous seasons or consistent returns this season. And I think pretty much every player I've spoken about here, there's not much risk of them getting benched, apart from Martinelli potentially, but we all know what he can do off the bench, right? So yeah, if you enjoyed the video, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a like rating. Let me know in the comments if there are any differentials that I've missed. Subscribe to the Golden Goal channel right there, and I'll see you in my next video.